In this video, I'll be sewing the new look 6659 skirt. I start simply by separating the pattern pieces on the tissue paper. I just cut in between each piece to make them easier to work with. I decided to make a muslin for this project, so here I am taking an old fitted sheet, ripping off the elastic and harvesting the elastic for future use. I decided to use this sheet because it's a linen material, which doesn't really look very bedsheety in my opinion, and we had lots of it. So I'm cutting out the muslin, and then here I am marking all of the pleat lines. This took me so long because I just hand basted down each of the pleat lines, and it took hours of work. After you hand baste it, then you sneak your scissors under there and snip them. I'm having trouble with it, so this wasn't gonna fly for how many pleat lines there were. Luckily, I came up with a new solution, which is to use that little purple thing to scoop under the thread and then snip it. Then you lift off the pattern piece, and it's fun because all these little thread marks are left behind. Here's an overview after I cut out all the pieces and pleated them. I just included a couple of shots of me sewing the muslin. I figure sewing muslin is not that exciting. I did French seams because linen frays. And I wanted this to be a wearable muslin, kind of a practice run of the garment to practice some skills that I haven't done in a while. Here's the main body of the skirt all sewn together. For the lining, I actually kept that channel that the elastic was in and just pressed it because it worked just fine as a hem. For the main fabric, I decided to use this technique that I saw on the internet to create a narrow hem. You take band roll, which is this nylon stiff material used for interfacing waistbands, and you pull out some strings to leave a sort of comb on the side. This comb makes hemming way easier, and you don't need to use pins. There's all the threads I took out. You start by lining it up with the edge of the hem on the right side and stitching within that comb that you created. Then you press it flat. And then you turn it over again, creating a double fold hem. Okay, you're supposed to be able to just pull this away. We'll see. So it worked. I stitched a bit too close to the edge, so it was a bit hard to unrip. But it did work, so you'll see it in the final garment. Here I'm just taking away all these little basting stitches that I had in the skirt from the beginning. The ones that got stuck in seams, I just pulled out with tweezers. Is usually the best way to do that. And I was left with this ball of thread. Here's the finished skirt. I really like how the lining and the zipper looks. I haven't mentioned it, but this pattern does not call for a lining, so I added it, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to practice a full muslin, not just for fit, but also to practice that technique. All right, I'm ready to sew. A couple things have to happen before I cut out the fabric. First thing I'm going to do is check the length of the long skirt, since the muslin I made was just the short version. I want to check the length of the long one with a skirt that I know I like and see if this is a good length or if I want to lengthen it, etc. So let me check that. So I'm lining it up with this skirt that I like the length of, And it's quite a bit longer actually. I mean, it's going to be hemmed, so it's about, I don't know, 4 inches shorter. I decided to work with my lining fabric first. This is a Bemberg lining, and it's really nice and soft and shiny. Super fun to wear. So now I'm cutting out my fabric. I heard this hack of using forks and cutlery as pattern weights, so I was trying it out. I don't think it's for me. I think I'm more of a scissors person or a pins person, but it was interesting to try. And here are all my pieces laid out. In this clip, I was kind of contemplating if it would be okay to use the selvage on the edge of some of the pieces. I did end up doing that. It might have changed the shape slightly and made it not lie completely flat in some places, but it was worth it to not have to do so many French seams. Bemberg is quite easy to cut, so I was able to use my slightly dull rotary cutter. It helps that I'm cutting one layer at a time, which you typically want to do with slippery fabrics. In this clip, I'm showing how I do the tailor's tacks to mark those small circles all through the pattern. Because it took me hours to mark the pleat lines on the last skirt, and I wasn't really sure if I wanted a very defined pleat in the black satin that I chose, I decided to skip that step. Since this is the lining and it's a dark color, I feel comfortable marking it. The possible tools I've got are this white chalk pencil and then this Choco liner from Clover. Let me see which works better. So as you can see, the blue chalk comes right off, whereas the white chalk pencil stays. And that is what I went with. Using my marked small circles, I'm forming the pleats, bringing them together, and then using these little cool plastic clips you'll see to lock it down. I use a combination of these little clips and pins before eventually basting it, of course. It's important to make the lining shorter than your main fabric, so I just trimmed an inch off all around. Now it's time to cut out my fabric. So the main fabric I chose is Radiance Silk. I bought it from Riverside Fabrics in Toronto. It's a cotton silk blend with a satin weave. So it has the benefits of the stability of cotton with the sheen and the luxuriousness of silk. I was really excited to use this fabric, and it's sold out everywhere, so the stakes are high. And then this is some silk organza. It's light pink. I got this for another project, but I decided to use it for the interfacing. I got it from GNS Dyes, and I love this clip of cutting it because it was so easy to cut since it's so thin. And then here are all the main fabric pieces cut out. I start by sewing them together. Because I used the selvages in my cutting layout, I was able to avoid some French seams. So the seam I'm sewing right now is just a normal seam. Pressing it, I used a self fabric press cloth and pressed it with the wool and silk setting on my iron. Time to put in pockets. So there's actually only one pocket in this skirt since it is a asymmetrical, pleated on one side, pocket on one side kind of skirt. So you just sew those pocket bags to each side of the skirt. Then you understitch. And then you sew the two side seams together and go around the pocket. To reinforce the pocket bag, I'm adding some zigzag stitches right next to the seam. Underneath the pocket is always a tricky place to finish the seams of. So I decided to use the bias binding. I just had a little scrap of it and it was the perfect length. I did a test on a small piece and then I attached it to the main seam. Now it's time to construct the lining in the same way as the main fabric. I was kind of bad, and on the lining I didn't use a press cloth. Since it was the lining, I wasn't as worried about water spots or any dirtiness from the iron. Here I am just pressing that seam open. I love this clip because in seeing the main fabric and the lining together, you notice how different two shades of black can be. In this clip, I'm basting the silk organza to the waistband pieces. These pieces are curved, meaning they can get stretched out really easily. So I took my time and I did it all by hand. The next step is to sew these waistband pieces together, and you end up with two waistbands. I start by pinning one of them to the main fabric with these little clips. To be extra secure, I then hand basted this seam. It gives you a lot of control and you don't have to worry about taking out pins while you're sewing or even taking out those little clips. Here I am sewing. This seam really stressed me out because, as I mentioned, it's curved seam and I find it really hard to make curved waistbands even. I don't know what happens, but it's hard to keep that width uniform. Okay, so far so good. It looks pretty good. Now I'm just going to do the same thing to the lining, and I'll end up with two skirts again. In this clip, I am sewing more silk organza interfacing, this time to the left side of the skirt where the zipper will be. So it's just a small chunk. I marked the seam allowance, 5/8 of an inch, with thread so I can see on both sides. Finished the edge with a zigzag, and then used my invisible zipper foot to install the zipper. I then finished with a French seam below the zipper. Now I get to combine those two skirts together, so I'm sewing both of the tops of those waistbands together. I hardly ever show myself trimming seams, so I decided to include a clip. I'm not trimming it too much because I still want to understitch, but just a little bit to reduce bulk. And here are my skirt guts before I understitch. This is understitching. It was hard to get a shot of this. Once they're attached, I then use my press cloth and press on the right side of the fabric to lock everything in. There is a faster way to attach a lining to an invisible zipper, but since I was just going off my own instructions for adding a lining, I preferred having the control and the kind of simplicity of using hand sewing. Before hemming, I decided to hang it overnight to let that fabric, relax and stretch out. Here I am doing the same band roll hem, narrow hem hack with the main fabric. I really made sure to not stitch too far this time, so it would be easier to take out and I wouldn't risk damaging the fabric. And of course I tried it with the lining first, and it came out a lot easier. My final sewing step is called stitching in the ditch, where you just stitch in that seam line. This is going to combine your lining and main fabric and make sure they don't shift. it was time then to pull out all those little basting stitches. This is pretty satisfying because it looks so weird with them in, and it's fun to take them out. I use my fingers mostly. And that's all the steps, so it's time to reveal what the skirt looks like. Here it is. I'm trying to capture the shine of the fabric. And the beautiful zipper, line zipper, it looks so nice always. Here's the narrow hem. I think it worked really well. And here is a shot of the skirt on. There are some imperfections. I wish I could have gotten some seams to lay a bit flatter, but overall it is exactly what I wanted, and it was a joy working with this fabric. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be sure to make more videos.